So I'll start then. Welcome everyone. My name is Dave Tamblin. I know most of you, or most of you know me. The presentation today is on assessing groundwater at risk of containing pathogens, which in fact, I can take some personal credit for giving that the moniker GARP. And they were at one point calling it GUAROP. And I said, no, you got to come up with something simpler. And GUDI or GUDI is an older term that many of you will be familiar with, and that's part of GARP, specifically looking at surface water influence. And I guess I should mention that I'm in Prince George, BC, on the unceded traditional territories of the Lheidli T'enneh, and grateful to be sharing this beautiful land from afar, because that's how we do things these days. All right, I will get started. Does this work? Yes. So I wanted to sort of start at high level and look at how people get sick from groundwater or surface water. How does one get sick? And this is the fecal oral route that all the health officers will be familiar with. And we in drinking water, we talk about the multi-barrier approach, and so I've put on here some physical barriers or illustrations of barriers. In order to get sick, a pathogen would have to get from the feces past all these barriers in order to actually make you sick. All right, and the top three of them, or if you include the feces there too, that's what we're going to be looking at today in terms of GARP. So that it would have to go from the depositional environment. There can be source protection measures, and then it has to have a transportation pathway to get to the well. And then we've got other barriers that come into play later on. So the idea of GARP just is groundwater at risk of containing pathogens. So it's just to do with pathogens. This is not to do with arsenic or magnesium, or sorry, manganese, any of the other chemical contaminants. So just to do with pathogens, and that's why we talk about disinfection. And when I say statutory obligation here, in the First Nations world, under federal jurisdiction, there is no statutory obligation, but we follow the provincial regulation as a guideline or a best practices guide. And so that means every single well that is used to supply a drinking water system should be assessed. And most of the community wells, I think, Ted or someone at this may have more information. I think most of the community wells will have some sort of assessment done. Certainly any new well will. But there is hundreds, if not thousands, but there's many individual wells that are also supplying people with drinking water that haven't been assessed. And so that's at the bottom of this slide where it says who should be doing this assessment. And it is a staged assessment, but the initial screening assessment, which is what we're going to talk about today, could be done by a health officer, right? And that's likely what would happen for individual wells. The community wells, you know, a health officer is certainly welcome to weigh in, but it would be typically a consultant would be doing the more detailed assessment there. Oh, one thing just to note that about the definition here, groundwater at risk of containing pathogens, as far as I know, that is a BC specific term. So it's good that, I think it's a good term. So I applaud the writers of the regulation. And I also applaud the fact that they wrote in, go ahead, Ted.
Yeah, it was Barry Betker was one of the people that helped put that language together. Yeah. And he was trying to explain to lawyers what they were talking about, and he said this, and they thought it sounded good, and they wrote it down. And I like it too. Yeah. At first, I was kind of worried about a BC specific thing that was different, but with time, I warmed up to it because we came to the GARP viral, which you'll get to, I'm sure, later on, which wasn't talked about in GUDI. So I thought that was an excellent,
Right.
excellent distinction for us. And so, yes. So the province does not believe that the Drinking Water Protection Act applies on reserve, but they believe that the Water Sustainability Act does apply on reserve. So I just wanted to point that out. Most of you have heard me say that before, but since there's so many of you EHOs on the call, I thought I'd just do that. But yes, every single new well, or when we do, even if it's not a new well, if we're doing a project, the very first thing is a source water assessment. That is job number one. And then we try to get a source water protection plan thing in place during the project, and many of you have been involved with that as well. It's the issue is the older wells that have never, maybe not even had a GUDI assessment. But you know, sooner or later we'll get to them all.
Yeah,
Thanks,
and that's reasonable it's reasonable to think that it's going to take time because all wells really should be assessed. The other thing I'll point out about the wording in the Drinking Water Protection Regulation is that they foresaw that there could be a conflict between the consultants, you know, who could be qualified professional engineers and geoscientists who may have an opinion, but they wrote specifically in that it was the opinion of the health officer that would be the final decider. So it's still an area of some conflict where you know, practicing hydrogeologist may have an opinion but not convince the health officer. Okay. So what does all this lead to? The risk of a source leads to the level of disinfection that is required or recommended. And surface water, I'll point out here, is most at risk, right? It's at the surface, so any sort of pathogen can easily get into it. And so that's sort of the basic for what we call full disinfection, or 43210. And so surface water, although it's highly variable in quality, is much simpler than groundwater in terms of the assessment that you have to do, the risk assessment, because you just assume that it's at risk. I know lots of people are very proud of their pristine mountain streams, but from a health protection perspective, we assume that all surface water is exposed to pathogens. So groundwater does become a little trickier. And I think if we went back, you know, 100 years, we would have said groundwater would automatically fall into that lowest box there, the low risk. But people tend to like to drill wells right beside creeks and lakes and so on, and so the idea that the surface water could get into the well is fairly well established. And so that led to the idea of GUDI, and so if there's going to be a significant amount of surface water entering the well, then it seems that surface water disinfection would be appropriate. So if it's what we call full GARP, then you again fall into the 43210. For those low risk wells at the bottom, there's really no particular need to disinfect the water. There may still be a need for residual or secondary disinfection in the distribution system, but the idea of low risk is that the physical setting and the aquifer and the well construction are such that there are no pathogens in that well. And then, yes, as Ted mentioned, there is this intermediate category, which is GARP virus only. And the reason that exists is that you could have wells that are not, you know, exposed to surface water, but are potentially exposed to viruses. And viruses fall into a special category because they're much smaller than the other pathogens. So they're more mobile. They also don't have the nutritional requirements of other you know, bacteria and protozoa, so that they can't die in that in the transport pathway. And so they have been assigned a treatment recommendation of 4 log reduction of viruses only, but the 0 after the 4,0,110 is saying you don't need to disinfect them for protozoa. And I've drawn a little ISC line saying that ISC and Health Canada recommend that all groundwater sources at least get the 4 log reduction of viruses. Where that's kind of not there's still a reason to classify something as low risk, even if you are going to disinfect it. And the reason is, well, what if the disinfection breaks down? Do you need to jump to a boil water advisory? And I think my thinking, and this is still something that's being discussed, but if it is truly a low risk source, even if the disinfection isn't working for some reason, then it would not automatically require a boil water advisory. So that's certainly a bit of a contentious issue. But those are the categories for disinfection. All right, so the current guideline, and I was involved in writing version 2. We're now on version 3, but it's much the same thing. So it dates back to 2017. Hopefully that link is still current, but who uses links anyway? Just go into Google and type in guidance document for groundwater at risk of containing pathogens, or words to that effect, and you should get it. But do make sure you get the 2017 version, because there is a 2012 version that is probably still floating around. It's about 50 to 60 pages, so it's not, it's not 300 pages or anything, but it's not 5 pages either. So it is. I was involved in drafting it, so, but I do think it's a good document. All right, so how is GARP different than GUDI? As I've very colorfully illustrated here, GARP is intended to be an umbrella term. So it includes GUDI, but it also includes other ways in which groundwater can be at risk of containing pathogens. So poor well construction, a vulnerable aquifer. We'll talk more about this infiltration pathway later on. So just GARP is GUDI plus. It includes all the possible ways that a pathogen could get into a groundwater source. And a key thing throughout this presentation is separation, and we can have separation in distance or in space or in time. And so the idea is that if you can keep those pathogens, all the pathogen sources, outside of proximity to the well, then we're going to be safe. Okay, and there is a distinction between horizontal and vertical, and it tends to follow about a 10-to-1 ratio, which is very much just a rule of thumb, but 10-to-1. So if you have 15 meters of separation vertically, that's equivalent to about 150 meters of separation horizontally. Now, with the viruses, we do bump it up a little bit to 300. And so anything within, any potential pathogen source that is within that separation distance is going to be considered a risk. Conversely, if you have things outside of that separation distance, that's considered safe. Okay, so you can have septic systems as long as they're more than 150 meters away. Although, keep in mind the virus thing is a little further, and basically 15 meters or 50 feet vertically is considered safe. Now, those are the rules of thumb, but keep in mind we're focusing here on an initial risk screening, not a detailed hydrogeological assessment. Now that same, oh, sorry, yes, the wise owl is pointing out that hydrogeologists often assume this 10-to-1 ratio, and that's based on hydrostratigraphy, how sediments tend to get laid down, just leads to this sort of relationship. Now, I actually prefer it because I was at one point a practicing hydrogeologist, and I did modeling in this. And what we would do is we would put particles. We'd have a numerical model of a well field, and we'd put, particles, virtual particles at the well screen, and we would trace them back in time magically through groundwater modeling. And you would get a picture something like this. And 200 days is a time that is mentioned in the Garp manual as being safe. So in other words, pathogens are assumed to survive in the subsurface environment for up to 200 days. This is an area where professional judgment does play a role, and I would feel more comfortable if it were like 400 days or maybe a year. So I've suggested 365 days here. But the concept is that pathogens are not multiplying in the subsurface environment. They're dying off, and they're dying off at different rates depending on the type of pathogens and the subsurface conditions. How much oxygen there is, how much food there is there a source of organic carbon or not. They're just trying to survive. And if we can extend out far enough in time, so if we could have a separation in time, that would be as effective as the separation in space. Now, I say I'll show you a quick and dirty approach later. That would actually be, I've tabled this Garp part 1. That would be in the part 2 talk where we would look at the calculation of travel time. But the same thing as the physical separation. If you're close to the well in time, then that's at risk, and if you're further away, then that's going to be not at risk. So on here, you should focus on the areas. Most of the contaminants are coming from the surface. So I don't know if I have a pointer on here. I'll have to figure out how to do a pointer. But where you see that 200-day contour intersecting the surface, those would be the points that are most at risk. So you definitely want to keep contaminants out of those areas. Now, where does 200 days come from? And I would say you see this a fair bit in public health, where when you trace things back and see where they came from, it's kind of shocking how little information is actually available. It's difficult. It's difficult to do research on pathogen survival in the subsurface. So I kind of understand that, but there's really shockingly little scientific basis for this 200-day thing. But when they looked at survival of coliforms and enterococci, Cryptoengiardia, they 200 days was the longest that they found. Now, if it's based on a very small sample, so if you project and say, well, what would the 95th percentile be? It could be quite a bit longer. So that's kind of why I'm saying is 200 days really the right answer. Clearly, it's going to be very complex, and the best thing to do would be to do, more detailed source water characterization, like, and probably in the future, if I'm giving this talk in 10 years, hopefully by then there will be some DNA type sequencing where we can characterize exactly what pathogens are in source water. Okay. Now, this is one of my favorite slides. As I said, as a former practicing hydrogeologist, this is bread and butter stuff here. So the key thing to notice on this diagram, hydraulic is flow of water, conductivity is how easily the water flows, and it's highly variable depending on the soil type. So the key thing is the vertical axis here and the fact that it's a logarithmic scale. So each line is a factor of 10 or 1 order of magnitude difference. And people don't encounter logarithmic scales all that frequently in everyday life. The Richter scale is a good example, or pH scale, but people don't deal with that day to day. So if you look at the difference between a fine sand and a silt, there's a difference of, so fine sand is 1 meter a day, with variability, and silt is 0.01 meters per day. Now, when you're looking at dry sand versus dry silt in your hand, it doesn't seem like there's that much of a difference, but there's actually a difference of a factor of 100. So water flows 100 times more quickly and easily through a fine sand than a silt. And again, 100 times faster through gravel than through fine sand. As a rule of thumb, if you see silt or clay or till in a well log, that's going to correspond with an aquitard, and anything from a fine sand upwards is going to be an aquifer. And there is this area in between, fairly commonly fine silty sand type things, where it's not a good aquifer, but it's also not a good aquitard. And yeah. Oh, and there's just a visualization of the different sizes of these particles. Oh, and there we go. For the kids in the audience, we've got the snail and the deer and the hawk. All right. So getting back into or getting to well construction, right, which is one of the ways in which GUDI is a generalization of the, sorry, GARP is a generalization of the GUDI thing. Well construction things. Some of these things are easy to see in the field once the well is drilled. Other things are you really only see if you get a chance to video the well. But is there a well cap? Is there a stick up? Wellhead grading is quite important. Make sure that the surface water drains away from the well rather than into the well. The surface seal or annular seal can sometimes be visible. Often it's not that visible. But things like cracks in the casing, cracks at the pitless adapter, those things are quite common, and those are very difficult to see. So those are well construction short circuit ways that water can very quickly get into a well. And if you're familiar with the Walkerton story, that was because of the well construction and the karst geology there, it was a short circuiting type situation at Walkerton. All right, and then there's also the well location. And I'll just highlight here the two boxes that talk about pathways. So the infiltration pathway is coming from the surface and generally going vertically down towards the well. And that's why things like wildlife, livestock, domestic animals, and septic systems are considered risk factors. There's also more of a horizontal pathway, which is the exfiltration of surface water getting into the well. And at the bottom there, the separation distance or setback is what we want. We want all of these risk factors ideally to be outside of the setback distance, which varies depending on how dangerous the different risk factors are. So we'll talk about that in a bit. Now, this slide is not, if you were diligent, if you were good students and you looked at the slides ahead of time, this slide was not in it. So I've added this in, and it's rather than just showing a bad well, this is a good well. These are the things you should be looking for in a drilled well. What I'll point out here is that they often show the static water level, but very important, and this would be if we went into this more advanced stage 2 type assessment, you would want to know what is the regional groundwater flow direction, what is the pumping level, not just the static water level in the well, because those things can affect travel time to the well. And like regional groundwater flow direction, I think is extremely important. And just imagine if you had a septic system that was within the setback distance, it would be completely different if it were up gradient than if it were down gradient. The other thing I wanted to show on this diagram is the idea of the well depth. And when we talk about well depth, you know, in 15 meters or 50 feet, we're not talking about the depth to the bottom of the well, and we're not talking about the total drilling depth, which is you might see on it would be listed on a well log. You actually want to look at the distance to the top of the screen. So top of screen is the key phrase for most wells. Now, for bedrock wells, which typically are only cased to the bedrock surface, the thing would be the uppermost productive fracture, productive meaning producing water. And for dug wells, well, dug wells are almost always going to come out as Garp, but you could look at the uppermost leaky joint. The concept, though, is the minimum vertical travel distance. So the depth of the well is not the physical, you know, drop a weight down to the bottom of the well. That's not what we mean. So this slide shows, this is taken, or I guess it's modified. This overall risk assessment process, and risk assessment and risk management process is in the form that we fill out at FNHA, which is the second PDF that was attached to the meeting invite, and it was not modified. And so you basically start off by doing the checklist for risk factors, right? And so the risk factors fall in 4 categories. The first is aquifer type. The next one is the well construction that we mentioned and well location. And the last one that we haven't talked about yet, but is probably most familiar to most DHOs, is the water quality results. So we'll go through how you do that checklist. And at this point, we're just going to say, are there any risk factors? And if the answer is no risk factors, then you move to the right to the low risk green box, and you're going to then not stop. You're going to continue with your long-term water quality monitoring, because this is not a one and done process. We're always going to be vigilant for changes in the risk. So if that long-term water quality monitoring starts turning up coliform indicator bacteria, then that's a good sign that we need to review this risk assessment. If we go down from that any risk factors triangle and say, yes, there were some risk factors, you don't immediately jump to treatment. You instead do a risk assessment. And that's where you have to put on your professional judgment hat and think about things and decide, well, maybe there is a risk factor, but it's still low risk. Or maybe there's a risk factor and it is, you know, likely that there is a risk. Or as often happens, we're missing information, and so there's a possible risk, but we don't really know when we want to do more detailed investigations. If it is at risk, then you still don't immediately jump to treatment, because there may be well alteration things that you can do. That tends to be for the more visible, simple things like inadequate stick up or you know, a not functional well cap, something like that. And if you do decide that you need more information or need to engage a hydrogeologist, then you know, you then have to do those additional investigations. All right, so we're going to jump in. We're all adults here, and adults learn by doing. I think kids learn by doing too, so it doesn't really matter. Everybody learns by doing. So we'll jump in, and this is an actual case that I worked on, Tumbler Ridge, a community in northeastern BC. Very scenic, very beautiful. And their water comes from wells but they chose to drill their wells right on the edge of Flatbed Creek. And there's campground right near where the wells are too. So I use IMAP BC, but there's lots of different mapping programs out there. But IMAP BC is nice because it has access to the provincial well registry layers and also the provincial aquifer classification layers. So there is an aquifer in this area that has been mapped, and it's called 625-2A. So what does that mean? Oh, and sorry, the actual production well is here. It's well tag number 52516. So let's look at the aquifer first. And that 625, that's just the number for the aquifer. You can just call it Joe's aquifer or the Tumbler Ridge aquifer or something like that. But 625 is just the number associated with it. And then the classification system has two parts. So this one is 2A. Well, what does that mean? 2 is, so the first part, and it can be 1, 2, or 3, is basically about water quantity. All right, so is it a productive aquifer? Are there a lot of wells drawing on the aquifer? It's basically asking, is the aquifer sustainable from a water quantity point of view? And because we're focusing on water quality, that first part of the aquifer classification doesn't really apply. We're not going to do it. The second part is the A in this case is A, B, or C, and that's what matters. And it's just A is for an unconfined aquifer, C is for a confined aquifer, and B is that intermediate type situation. All right, so this being a 2A aquifer, I would say that's an unconfined aquifer, and therefore at risk of containing pathogens. Or, sorry, more likely to be at risk of containing pathogens. Even if there isn't a mapped aquifer, you can make an assessment of the type of aquifer by looking at the well log. If you don't have a well log and you don't have an aquifer mapping, you're kind of hooped. I'm not too sure. Then it's a difficult situation. You can look at the well depth, but well depth is not a good indicator of aquifer type. Okay, so focus on that, the letter, the A, B, and C, and hopefully hope for C's. C's are better than A's. This is the well log that's recorded in the wells database. So this information this is an older version, but the same information is available in the present version. And the well tag number is there, 52516. Just hopefully everyone is aware that a well tag is not the same as a well plate. They sound like the same. In fact, tag sounds like more what that thing is, but that is a plate. The illustration there, the metal thing. The well tag is just an electronic database number like the number 625 for the aquifer. It doesn't mean anything. You can go to the well and walk around and look for 52516. You will never find it anywhere. So what do we know here? We know the owner. We can see that it was a drilled well. It's 8 inches in diameter. That's useful because you get out in the field and you're like, which well is it? Because there's various wells. So knowing the diameter can be useful for identification. The well depth here is 156 feet. That's to the bottom of the well, not the number we'll use for Garp. It was drilled in 1983. Good productive well, 600 and some gallons per minute. Fairly shallow static water level. I assume that's because it was drilled right at the edge of the creek. And then very important is this lithology information. So we've got some topsoil, you can ignore that pretty much. And then we're into sand and gravel. So that's why it was classified as an unconfined aquifer. There's no mention of silt or clay or anything like that there. So that looks like a good unconfined aquifer to me. Okay. However, I do question whether it was an unconfined aquifer, and the reason is that in addition to the production well, there was also a test well drilled beside the production well, and they took a little more care in recording the soil types in the test well. And when you look at the test well, we do see sand and gravel, but then you'll see some other things here, some clay, silty, some gravel and silt. So it's a little more complicated picture than you would get from the actual production well log. And this is where you know, from a hydrogeology point of view, we know that it's not the average diameter or the average component that is most important, but actually the finest component, because those finest components tend to get into the pores, and so the hydrogeological behavior is going to be determined more by the finer parts of it than the average particle size. Now, the one caveat there is the word trace. If you see something that has a trace amount, you can pretty much say, okay, that's they're like trace clay, I wouldn't worry about. But when it says some clay, that's a significant amount of clay. So I would say focus on the finer elements here. So when I see all these things, the silt and clay associated with a lot of the layers, that makes me think this is not maybe a completely unconfined aquifer. This is the taken a screenshot from the form that we fill out, and it's just sort of information about the well. I think I've got a little thing here where it fills it all in for us, so we can just watch the magic as it goes along. The sanitary survey is an important part there. There's a little box there that says sanitary survey. In the field, I would historically sanitary survey for a well. You've looked up to 30 meters away. I'd encourage you to push it a little bit, go up to 100 meters. Trying to do a 300 meter sanitary survey in the field, that would be days of work. I don't think that's reasonable. So some of it you will have to do from a desktop. Very important is the location of the well, the lat and long, and you can get that these days very easily on your phone. But do make sure you record it using the decimals, not using degrees, minutes, and seconds. And that's it. Now you notice here I put in the well depth as 111 feet, even though I think it said 156 or something on the actual log. That was because 111, that was the depth to the top of the aquifer, which is where I would assume they put the screen. I don't actually know. This is a fairly common thing where they didn't write down where the screen was. But 111, that's the top of the aquifer. So that's a conservative estimate of the minimum vertical travel distance. Okay. And that's just what I said. Use a GPS and the phone is accurate enough. We don't need to, we're not doing like a construction layout where you need a total station. Just a general idea within 5 or 10 meters is great. Now the next, so the first question in terms of the risk factors, we've got down the demographics of the well. Now we're into risk factors, is about the aquifer. So it appears to be a vulnerable aquifer. Or sorry, it's listed as an A or vulnerable aquifer, but I think that it's actually probably semi-confined. And how would you actually find out? You would do a pumping test. The shape of the drawdown on the pumping test tells you whether it's a confined aquifer or not. So if you really want to know, you want to do that more detailed assessment, that's how you do it, is with a pumping test. But even if it was an A aquifer vulnerable, the fact is it doesn't meet the criteria here because we've got enough vertical separation. It's not 15 meters below the ground. It's like 130 or 40 meters below the ground. So it's going to be considered low risk, even though it is a vulnerable aquifer. Now, the next question is about the well location, and I think I skipped over karst. There's a question in there about karst aquifers, but we don't have any karst, or there's very little karst, I should say, in BC. That karst is, stalactites and stalagmites and that sort of thing. So well location. So this is where your sanitary survey comes in. And in this case, there was a pit privy about 40 paces away from the well. So, and you'd never see it obviously on a map or even on an aerial photograph. So that's a thing. You should also look for dwellings, and really the septic systems are the biggest risk, I think. So trying to find out if there's houses anywhere nearby, find out you know, how they deal with their sewage, if they're on a community sewer or individual septic. And that's something that on reserve we tend to know that. All right, so that is a risk factor. Now I've put, just, you say, well, pit privy, that's like an outhouse, that's got to be highest risk there is, right? You got untreated sewage sitting there. Not necessarily, because that pit privy could be constructed with a, you know, a proper fiberglass tank that gets pumped out. So you need to know a bit more about how that pit privy is constructed. So that's why I've listed that as indeterminate. And the next one is the trickiest one. This is the vertical and the horizontal pathways. And so we're going to go to a diagram to look at that. And it's basically, there's two things. There's are you in the floodplain or not? And if you are in the floodplain, is it a shallow well? Right? So if it's less than 15 meters and you're within the floodplain, then that's considered yes, that is a risk. What is the floodplain? Some places, I guess, have floodplain mapping. Most places don't. And so you would just have to look, you know, use your professional judgment and try and see where you think the high water mark is. Does it really need to be the 200-year floodplain? I don't think so. If it's something that, you know, we're gonna need to not use this water once every 200 years, then okay, we'll do that. If there's a that sort of level flood, there's going to be lots of other things to deal with. But if you can look and see, like the top of bank is a typical thing. Look at the vegetation. How low does the vegetation seem to grow on the bank? Now, if you're outside of the floodplain, then are you within 150 meters of the floodplain? And if so, then you want to know, then you need to look at the water level in the creek or river or lake, whatever the surface water body is. And this is the trickier, this is definitely trickier, but you want to know, do I have 15 meters of vertical separation, right? So if you're going to be within that area, then you want to go deeper. You need to go more than 15 meters below the bottom of the creek. Or, I mean, most creeks or rivers are fairly shallow, so you can just use the normal, well, whatever the water level is there. You don't go by the top of bank, though. You should go by the actual water level or at the bottom of the creek if you can estimate it. So if you're more than 15 meters below, then you're okay. But if you're within 15 meters of the water level in the creek, then that is considered a risk factor. The other thing you can do, of course, is be above. So if you're above the high water level, then it's not a concern. All right, so this is I think it's 5A and 5B in the GUDI document, but in the Garp guideline, this is basically the GUDI assessment. Is there a surface water influence? And I'm going to skip over this. This is just a little more detailed drawing of what was in the previous one, but it includes the idea that there's an upper safe zone, a far safe zone, and a deep or lower safe zone. And you want to try and be in one of those safe zones. So in this case, this was screened as low risk. And you say, but it's right on the edge of the creek. It must be at risk. But if you go through the vertical separation, you know, we had 111 meters deep, so that's 34 meters. And then the creek was, the surface water level or static water level was 9 feet below, but by eye it looked like the creek was a couple meters below that. And so that's 29 meters. So that means the top of my screen or the top of my aquifer is 29 meters below the creek, so I easily meet the 15-meter separation distance. Okay, so it's low risk, even though it's drilled in the floodplain right at the side of the creek. Okay, now the next set of risk factors are about well construction, and this is one where the first one is about surface sealing, or the annular seal. There probably isn't a seal, but I screened it as low risk anyway. In other words, I don't think that given this hydrogeologic environment, which is, you know, alluvial deposition or river deposition of sands and gravels, I don't think that there's going to be any short circuiting along the side of that well casing, right? The next one is about a well cover. So it was in a pump house and it was covered. That was good. Flood proofing. It was reportedly built to the 200-year flood level. Even though it's in a pump house, it could still flood. And the thing to look for is a drain, right? So what if there was a leak? Would the pump house somehow fill up with water, and could water get in through the top? And so even just a gap under the door can function as a drain or an actual floor drain. And yes, there was a stick up, so that's good. Oh, sorry, I've said the stick up was good. Oh, right, okay. But the wellhead protection, I considered it vulnerable because it was so close to the edge, and it looked like there was some active erosion on the creek. So, you know, fast moving creeks move around all the time. And so that's I consider that to be a risk factor, is that the whole well itself could become undermined by erosion if there was a big flow event. So that was a risk factor. Now, often for well quality, we don't have much data when if it's a new well, and so that I've put in 24. You want to have at least 24 samples, and so it's often going to be indeterminate for new wells. But keep in mind that this is a process, and so you can still make a decision based on early data, but you often don't know you don't have definitive information for new wells. This being an existing well, there was a very good sampling history. They had 0 positive for indicator bacteria on 163, so that's good. They also had low turbidity. And confirmed history of disease is the next question, and that's going to be none. If you had a well that had a confirmed history of disease, I'm sure you would no longer be using that well, but that question is there. So the form, this was my work, and I'm embarrassed to say how difficult it was to make the PDF do this, but it counts up how many at risk, how many low risk, and how many intermediates there are. And I've said yes because there was one at risk. So what it says then, this is the risk assessment part where you have to put on your thinking cap. Is it disinfection or remediation? Okay, so in this case, the risk factors, there's the indeterminate one, which was the pit latrine, and then the second thing is the erosion risk. So probably I'm going to assess the pit latrine, maybe close it if possible, see if it can be closed, or at least find out if it is, pumped out regularly, and if the tank appears to, I have reason to think that the tank is intact. And for the bank erosion, probably recommend some work to protect the bank, riprap or something. Oh, and put in a well ID plate. I recommend always putting in a well ID plate. You will get some pushback. Some First Nations users don't want to, buy into the provincial regulation thing. You're not subject to provincial regulation just because you put a well plate on it. You're not signing any contract. It's just to identify that there is a potable drinking water source here, and then it shows up on maps, and it just makes it easier for people to take that into account whenever projects are being considered. So options, you could treat it, right? I mean, treatment is not a bad option. It's quite inexpensive for many, like for private homes, UV and microfilter, not all that expensive. The pit privy should be assessed and either given the thumbs up or closed. Yeah. So that was my assessment. And then the last part of the form is where you sign off. And I'm proposing a two-stage sign off where someone completes the form and then someone else reviews it. So my review comments, I guess in the scenario, I said the EHO filled it out and myself or manager, really just a second set of eyes, you know. And so I said I concur with the EHO's recommendations. Right. All right, so that's basically it. We're at the summary now. Look at that, the Garp guideline. Use the sheet. As I said, you learn by doing so. Take the Garp form that's attached to this invite and go out in the field and assess a couple private wells and see how it goes. And definitely come to me with any questions. I've tried to keep it fairly conceptual here. Think about what is the actual risk. So if there's no pathogen source, there's no risk. If the pathway is separated in space or in time sufficiently, then there's no pathogen risk. And if you're not sure, then you know, definitely consult with people who can give you free advice, or if necessary, say, hey, I think we need to hire a hydrogeologist to do a more detailed assessment. And there's sometimes money available for that sort of thing too. So that is the end of my presentation. And if there's questions, we have 5 minutes left for questions. But you can always send me email questions if something comes up. So thanks for your attention, and now's the time to ask now or ask later. That really doesn't matter. So.
Dave, this follow.
Yes.
I just have a question. I'm not sure if you had clarified. I'm a little confused as to, so you say potential sources of contamination 150 feet away, but when we're looking at like standard practice manual and septic systems, they say, you know, 100 feet away from a well. So why is there that difference?
That's a great question, Paolo. Because two different sets of people came up with the guidelines. So yeah, the standard practice manual is not completely consistent with the Garp guidance manual. And you know, so most of the most private homes that have, you know, septic fields, which is where you're going to get the standard practice manual coming into play. If they're on individual wells, they're not subject to the drinking water protection regulation. I mean, that's one sort of, is it a good answer? It's not a really good answer, but it's sort of an answer. The other thing is, you know, it's possible that you could have a septic system that complies with the standard practice manual, but the water is still at risk of containing pathogens and requires disinfection. I don't think the standard practice manual makes any claim that if you follow this, then wells won't require disinfection. I'd be surprised if that statement is anywhere in there. I would have recommended them not putting that statement in. But it's certainly it would make more sense, I think, if they were completely consistent. But you've pointed out they are not.
Yeah, so if you're going to put a well in, you can't put it near your septic, but you can put your septic near an existing well. It's not very logical, but it is what it is. I also worry about septics and how effective they are. And Dave, I wouldn't say there's a ton of research on that either. There's a lot of gaps in the research on pathogen transport in ground. and particularly with viruses, because viruses are difficult, and you when you do viral studies, you have to, there's no way of using anything to say that there's a virus there. There's some indicators, but there's no, oh, if I've got this, I know we would have a virus, and the virus testing at this point is not cheap and quick like bacterial testing. So.
Absolutely, and the other thing, you know, I said this is screening. So if you're just looking at a horizontal setback, you're kind of assuming that water flows directly from that source towards the well. And for most, you know, individual wells, which is where this is going to be applied, but even community wells, the capture zone is very much influenced by any sort of regional gradient. And so you're going to have a very long capture zone up gradient and a very short capture zone down gradient. So it's possible that you could have septic systems with, you know, quite close to a well, not going to have any, you would never find any influence. So that's why I say the screening is quite conservative, because it deals with setback distances rather than actual travel pathways. But yeah, in terms of what's the major risk, I would say septic is probably a much more considerable risk than the surface water risk that we focused on, I think, you know, 20 or 30 years ago. Maybe Ted focused on that 20, 30. I was a young kid 20 years ago.
I was able to get my shot when they lowered it the age to 40.
Ah, good. But yeah, I'm quite hopeful that we will be able to get better information about what viruses and other pathogens are in groundwater and surface water, frankly, in the future, but we're not there yet.
Yeah.
Hi, Dave. I have a question. Thank you for all that information. I'm just trying to do one. And I have a few questions trying to fill out all the slot. And one of them is like the vertical separation, like the total well depth. Like for example, well depth is total well depth is 54 feet, but then you said this the top of screen. So it says the screen is set at 48 inches to 54. So would that mean it's like, will you calculate it, say it's 48, and then it would be like less than
48? Yeah, the top. So 48, you said inches. I assume it's 48 feet, though?
Yes, at 40.
Or meters.
Feet. Yes, 48 feet, yeah.
Yeah, so yeah, you would use the top of the screen as the depth of the well.
Great, thank you.
So use the 48 for sure.
Yeah, and the other one was like the turbidity question. I know you said around 5 NTU, but I mean, I have data, but it's around like it fluctuates around, let's say 1 NTU. I think it does fluctuate between seasons. Of course, we don't have that data to say that it does, but
yeah. So turbidity is something. Oh, so, sorry, I think I cut you off there, Priscilla.
Oh no, go ahead.
Turbidity
Yeah.
is something where we usually don't have as much turbidity data as we would like to have. You would like to see some turbidity in itself. In most wells is just clay. You know, it's just inorganic particles. In some cases, especially if there is nearby surface water, it could be turbidity from pathogens. Pathogens like crypto and bacteria are the right size to cause turbidity. In most cases, the turbidity, though, is mineral or inorganic turbidity, and it is not a risk factor. But how to do that distinction is pretty tricky. That's why I put in 5 as a guideline, as opposed to 1 NTU is what you would really be looking at for most drinking water assessments. But I think Health Canada is coming out with a new turbidity guideline, and I hope they're going to address that that issue because it is important. Go ahead, Ted.
Yeah, and if you think it's coming from the surface, like a surface water, then that turbidity is usually variable over time, as is temperature. So the hydrogeologist will start looking at those other things if you really think that that's what you have. That's kind of like the older GUDI kind of stuff. But so there's a number of things you can do to try and determine. And we don't have that happen very often. It happened up at Halfway River. So 99% of the time, the water looks like groundwater coming down to the river. But then when the river stage is really high, all of a sudden there's surface water extremely close to the wellheads. And certainly, I can't remember, Dave, but I think it might have even been that there was a driving pressure from the river to the wells. And so if you're going to define those wells by that event, that means you're going to have a pretty sophisticated treatment system for an event that doesn't happen particularly often, but can happen. And when it does happen, nobody seems to react. So now we're going to have to treat for iron and manganese, and other, although we're okay with that and keep an eye on it. So some of these situations are kind of tricky. But then again, the tricky ones, this is the screening thing. And if it screens, pretty easily that it's okay, then chances are it is okay, because the screening tool tends to kick things in rather than to kick things out. So at any rate, that's not a bad thing. And then we go and take a look at it more closely. There's some that like at Chiam, they got the Fraser Valley Regional District. The water well is well within 30 meters of a sewer force main. And yet the health authority hasn't done anything about that well. So they do not require the regional district to disinfect the well or move the sewer line or move the well or do anything. And one of the last outbreaks we had in the province was a sewer force main that was broken in, Princeton, and entered their drinking water well and infected a bunch of kids 20 years ago on their way through to a tournament. That's how they found the outbreak.
Also see turbidity in new wells if the drillers haven't established the well properly as well. So if they don't do enough pumping, you can start seeing still continued turbidity events, just for the fact that they didn't develop the well properly.
Yeah, absolutely. New well turbidity is extremely unreliable as a risk factor. As Ted said, it's really the seasonal variability, and you can't, things like water temperature, but it can be a good indicator, because groundwater does not usually, unless it's very shallow groundwater, but deep groundwater doesn't have any sort of seasonal temperature fluctuation. And so if you are seeing a seasonal temperature fluctuation, then that's an indicator of surface influence. Having said that, to get that seasonal, to assess that over a season would be, at least 12 months of collecting the data. So it's not a quick assessment.
And even then it doesn't, and even then it doesn't preclude effective in situ filtration. So always try to point out to people that the filters that most municipalities have 1.5 meters of fairly uniform sand, and they're filters. And you look at what Dave had there. We had 100 feet of very non-uniform materials, including the fines. And that's pretty typical of what we see in the field. There are places in the province, though, that are at risk. So I would say like the upper Fraser Valley, or not like the lower mainland. So the Chilliwack area has some really coarse sand and gravels, very prolific aquifers, and would be at risk. If there were viral sources nearby, and that's another if. So it's like, do you have the stuff in this place, and then does it? Are none of the other things in place that would allow it to come in?
Prince George is a fascinating example because the wells are right on the edge of the river. They are fairly deep, but and they're fantastically productive. So you know it's all gravel down there. But they have been assessed as non-GUDI, non-Garp by professional hydrogeologists. So yeah, being close to a river doesn't necessarily make you automatically GUDI or Garp. So it's the travel time is the real key thing.
Or even find water.
Well, I know we're that's why they drill them there. They're not stupid. We are a bit over time, I think. So I don't. As I said, happy to answer any questions by email, but I don't want you to go hungry, missing your lunch. So I will say thanks for your attention and interest. And this was billed as the inaugural PHE webinar or FEVinar. I encourage other EPHS staff to put together a little presentation and share whatever your special area of interest is. And we can make a little catalog of training videos. So if there's nothing else, thanks for your attention and have a great rest of your day.